Thank you very much for this wonderful and stimulating paper. Well, it's hard to comment something after so brilliant papers, but I'm going to try to briefly highlight something that the papers have in common. And, well, it is obviously that we started with gestures. And the transformation of gestures as well. I mean, this kind of also of transformation of energy. And the gestures that are transformed, reactivated. And it's this reactivation, the capacity of inversion, as Didi Huberman showed us. Not just only the pathos formel or leidend pathos, but this transformation into a triumph pathos, which can take place. And it lets me also to think about what Uwe Fleckner have been saying about Manet, and how Warburg arranged this exhibition of Manet from the Leiden's pathos, melancholic, to the solar, more ecstatic iconography. Everything has to do with this conversion, and this conversion of energy needs also a place, a space, a distance. A distance that we have also seen in the exhibition, in the paper of Anke de Hessen, in the way of distance that the person is going through the space and having contact with these objects and perceiving the objects, but also distancing from these objects in an act of reflection. And to the end, well, the paper which unites science and the art, the part of art of Kurt Foster. It put like a synthesis in the sense of what element does this change of energy. We have been talking about memory and what moves this memory. And I think that what moves this memory is imagination. And I put this term because Aby Warburg was also very interested in imagination. Sometimes he calls imagination the fantasy. But coming back to Manet, he has a very nice quotation, which I want to read. So he says, die Logik der Fantasie erschafft einen Denkraum. The logic of fantasy creates a Denkraum, a space of reflection, a space of contemplation as well. It is a schöpfendes Organ, a creative organ. We have here the physiological part of the imagination. And he ends, it's an art Ganglion dynamischer Umschalter, a changeover switch. So maybe we can open a discussion rethinking the role of imagination for the memory and how it was important for Aby Warburg, and he has in the introduction also of the Mnemosyne, the anschwingende Fantasie. I mean, this element which can change the energy and the polarity of images. So I can hand it out to Gerhard Wolf to comment.
Well, I mean, that's a difficult task, but it's trivial to say that. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. So, well, I mean, if we collect the pictures and the ideas, thoughts, words, and whatever happened this morning in this room, if we collect them, we have a very strong kind of tensions and questions. I mean, for example, on the one hand, there was a very strong focus on energy, dynamis, and the energy between the unorganic and the organic. In the passage where the difference between the unorganic and the organic is not anymore relevant, where we go from Einstein to biology to Warburg and beyond. No? I mean, that's one strong argument. But we also had, for a while, seeing the breakfast in the green. I mean, the addition is your left. No? That means not energetic people dancing around. And I'm very grateful that you brought the notion of distance into it. So if the machine which moves, creates and moves the images, and chromatic energy in the images themselves has a counterpart in that part in Manet, which is man, no? The first three letters to bring that game again on the table, which has been played by somebody this morning, and it was Uwe Fleck, no? The maniac, the Manet, and the man, no? I mean, so then you get into this kind of dynamics. How is the depression, the slow motion, the melancholic, taking part in the machine of dynamic migration? No? How is this tension negotiated? So what is the role of the interstices, Denkraum, etc., which is also migrating, if you want. It's part of the of what has been transculturally transported. Otherwise, the game would not function. So there is a kind of theory of relativity in the velocities of energetic transmission, because it's not running. We should not overemphasize, that's my word to quote now, we should not overemphasize that energy is always running at high speed. It has its potentiality, which can be reinverted. That's what you said, and then what also Uwe Fleckner said, and to Anke packed it, so to speak, into the chocolate bar. It is also potential and can reinvert in depression as a state of energy, if you want, and not as a way of being out of energy, but rather being depressed by means of too much energy around or within a system, which, so to speak, tends not to uprising hands, but to implode, if you want. Well, I mean, uprising hands, Georges, that can also not only mean discharge, but also be disarmed. No, I just want to comment on that. If I raise my hands in front of you, that means I'm not armed. You can shoot on me if you want, or don't do it. No? I mean, the dynamics of the polysemia of the gesture of the raised arms, the raised hand, and what the hands do, and the arms are raised, and how this interplay works out, is an extremely fascinating question, and which is, so to speak, counterbalanced by what Uwe Fleckner has shown us. So I think there is a potential which we can inscribe then in the whole conceptual framework which you have shown. I mean, on a way this morning, we had a wonderful, and I say creatively chaotic interplay of working on and working with Warburg, no? And also of working beyond Warburg. I mean, you have, George has started to work with Warburg and bringing it into a dimension of questioning the political and bringing it back into Warburg to asking what is a place of the political within the Demossyne Atlas, bringing very quickly, was nice to watch you, from one plane to the other. But then you have worked beyond Warburg by means of doing so, no? By questioning how can a political iconology, in the broadest sense of the word, be realized today by means of looking historically into that material, but also by going into very contemporary photography. And we should not underemphasize photography in the whole game, because the photography has the interstice. It's not the permanently running picture. Even if you say Eisenstein has the cut, and the cut is a kind of montage, no? But the photography creates this kind of stills, if you want, which then get into a series. So this was, I always need to speak at least an hour to get warm mentally, and then I say something interesting. So I'm sorry for self-interrupting me before that. But one point is this emphasis, the focus on this individual figure, the one figure with a raised arm, the one figure with a gesture, the one person throwing the stone. But we have also to see the person the stone hits. No, you have the interplay of the figures. That means a more complex syntax or syntaxes, no, of the interaction of gesturing bodies, where energies are not only cellular but intercellular. Not only individual but collective, and create social spaces by means of energetic tensions or let's say meta levels of energy. And I think this is something we could explore with Warburg and also beyond Warburg. And it's one of the things I would be interested in, that calling syntax. I mean, Warburg has structured at least two corpora, no? One pictures and one books. Try to compare the library, the concept of good neighborhood, which seems to be simple but is everything else but that, and that of the series of pictures which are sometimes thought to be the documentation of a result of migration processes which brings things by means of photography on the same mediatic level, and stuck them there as a chain, not Kublerian, as a chain which document this kind of migration. Whereas a book is standing, creating a neighborhood where it's also a kind of osmotic and energetic exchange model. So try to compare the library and the photographic syntax, the two syntaxes or syntagmata of what Warburg have created. We tend to forget the library when we speak about the photographs, and the photographs when we speak about the library. I think we should try to get the meta level of ordering word and image in the work of Aby Warburg. Every kind of constellation of objects or pictures you can call, if you want, a temporary or a manebit exhibition, no? If you would like to do so. And this kind of bringing together the object constellations into a historical or reflection about the history of exhibitions Anke has opened up was terribly fascinating. It goes in line in what you have said. It goes so much in line that one desired to hear a second part of your lecture, if you want. That would have been that what in the 70s, 80s also happened. There was a strong reference to Warburg in exhibition culture by means of, I don't know, L'Âme du Corps, Werner Hoffmann's Nana, no? And mannerism, to take an M-A-N syllable again for that. Mannerism is also money, no? And you know what I mean. So this would very Kunst am Wiederrhein 1400 to say that. You see Brady come here. No, I mean this kind of exhibitions in the 80s. I would have added then the Magicien de la Terre, no? As an extremely important exhibition which goes beyond that level of the, let's say, European model, because I would answer Kurt's question, which memory where? I mean, it's quite explicit in Warburg that he is an Europeanist. He wants to create a European, let's say, mnemic identity by means of this work. I mean, that can be shown looking into his text. So, well, these are a few unsystematic thoughts. There's more on the paper here, but I may stop here. Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you.
So we ask our speakers to come to the podium, please. So, well, the questions. Oops, we have here the first question.
So, should I start? I'd like to defend my rashness in dismissing Warburg's receptivity to cinema. The very fact that in 1929, the incident you cite with Mussolini and the Wochenschau, the very fact that in 1929 Warburg could have a response to the Wochenschau that he could equally have had to the Mitchell and Kenyon films of 1901 or the Lumiere films of 1895. In other words, look, that just happened, here it is in film. That, I think, itself proves a lack of attention to the montage technique, such as it may have been in the Wochenschau that was going on in the 1920s. It's a singularly unsophisticated response to cinema. I mean, my general sense of Warburg is that as a Hamburg patrician, he wouldn't have been caught dead in the Nickelodeon. And that probably mostly explains why he wouldn't have been particularly receptive to cinema. That was the correct boss.
Well, that's just an opinion. You heard mine. They differ.
So, another question? Yes, please.
Yes, I've got some things to say in response to Anke's very interesting paper about those exhibitions, having been quite close to Jean-Claire. First of all, in terms of the very first one, that all those things came out of the wave of Duchamp retrospectives in the United States and really Europe's intellectual discovery of Marcel Duchamp. And after that wonderful paper about thinking of Warburg with Manet, just to say how interesting it would be to try and think Warburg with Duchamp, because the issue of their contemporaneity is very pertinent. The second thing about Les Immatériaux is that, of course, you didn't actually say that inside the gorgeous packaging was the first experiments of, needless to say in France, grand homme with computers as interchanging their idea. I'm sure they did it all with their secretaries. But what's very interesting and more pertinent is at that moment, it was all very textual. They weren't able to anticipate a scenario of Google Images, which was mentioned 2 days ago. It didn't occur to them that this network could be non-textual, which is what we're now involved with. And of course, the intermediary here, whom I would love a conference to be devoted to, is Malraux and the idea of the museum without walls, who comes straight out of all these things. And I think that his kind of being like Moses on the threshold of what has now happened digitally is important. And the third thing is just, I was so very glad you mentioned Jean-Claire, because of course he'd come out of things like doing Vienna 1900, which links back to the Wunderblock, which projected forward into the Wunderblock exhibition. But also I wanted to mention, although you did say very quickly, I don't think people got it just now, L'âme au corps, Arts et Sciences, Arts and Sciences, 1794 to 1994, to actually commemorate the split in the French Academy between art and sciences. But what people maybe hear, even if they know that exhibition, which is so pertinent to this art-science interface today, is that I was on the honorary committee and I experienced this terrible, impossible tension that became bitter with the two curators. One was the man who wrote Neuronal Man, okay, Jean-Pierre Changeux, and the other, someone who'd had 25 years of psychoanalysis, arts and science. So I'm being told to be quiet. But the arts and science show is very important.
Can I add a little remark to what you just stated, to what you said about the non-textual? I think there's a tragic misunderstanding, because there is no non-textual images at Warburg. The Mnemosyne Atlas was intended to be a book accompanied by a text. It was just not finished. And all the exhibition plates that I and others showed, they had extended texts aside. They are just lost, most of them. They were long lectures by Warburg, accompanied by slides, most of the time, and then a demonstration in front of those screens, in the presence of the public. And what is even more, it was not only a text, it was a performance. You have to imagine, he was so happy when few people came to his lecture, so he could ask everybody, please stand up with me, come to the screens. And then you must imagine this energetic man standing there, gesturing in front of the image of gestures, dancing in front of the material. This was a textual experience. And now, we poor devils, we have to take the images and we have to replace the text which no longer exists. There are some notes. In very rare occasions, we have even extended text. It's two. The Manet is only on one plate, actually. In the Boll lecture, he has extensively written, but everything else we have notes. The first line is, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you, and then there's an ending line, and in between we have pages and pages of notes, and no text. This is tragic, but we have to take this into consideration.
Yes.
Just a very short, I promise, a very short statement about your three examples, which were extremely well chosen. Because finally, if you, if you question the becoming of these three persons, Lyotard, Jean-Clair, Zeman. One, Lyotard finished in what I can say, an apocalyptic of postmodernism. The other, Jean-Clair, in apocalyptic anti-modernism. And only Zeman was able, at the end of his life, to put in, together Janikian's films and Victor Hugo's drawings. Yeah. I think Zeman is the good person for afterlife, because Claire and Lyotard, one on left wing, right wing, and the other, said that it is over.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. May I? No. May I say a few words? And I try to be very, very short. Yes, very short. There is always the question for the beginning. And of course, Gerhard, you are right. We could have the exhibitions like Werner Hofmann's exhibitions in the Kunsthalle or even the Kunst am Niederrhein, of course. But the point is that these three persons, as you now, George, showed, these three persons had a very special way to exhibit things. Not only that, the whole context of these exhibitions was exactly that, what we called yesterday kulturwissenschaftlicher background. And that is exactly what interests me so much, that there are, of course, and L'Amour is one of the exhibitions that follows in '92, and that is so interesting. And of course, there are in the art historical scene a lot of exhibitions. And just remember, for example, the Venice Biennale on art and science. I mean, I could put that in, but the point is that these three persons show their own development.
So, please.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to turn back from Zeman to Zemon, and my question is directed to Kurt Forster.
So there are you have difficulty hearing.
If you can hear it. Hi. I think I find it relatively convincing that that for Warburg, images or symbols were effectively served the function of Zemon's mneme, as a sort of crystal of memory. He talks about the biology of the symbol in certain places. But your juxtaposition of odd sounds, your juxtaposition of Zemon with the Durkheim school raised some questions for me, which have to do with the individualistic point of departure of Zeman's theory of memory. So, whereas Durkheim conceived of society as an organism, Zeman thought of the transmission and preservation of memory in solely individualistic terms, physiological terms, and hence his theory of memory had to be framed as Lamarckist in order to be social. So, depending on what degree of influence he had on Warburg in reality, this is a kind of broader question. And does Warburg's Kulturwissenschaft have a robust concept of culture, in fact?
You're asking, does it have a robust?
Yes.
Well, I think your question blazes through very major issues in the fields of course, the sociological study of religion and and the construction of social entities. On the whole, I can't possibly hope to add anything to clarify what I must have obviously exhibited with some distressing imprecision. But on the one point, I would think it'd be hard to argue that the entire group, that's why I called them a circle of Leipzig physiologists, the entire group stemming from Wundt, and in the particular case, centering on Ostwald and Zeman, thereby representing the two extreme divergent branches of the Leipzig circle, had a decisive impact, not only upon Warburg. One can demonstrate that just on a sort of statistical basis of the diffusion of ideas and information, and certainly provided the terminological basis. That the terms that Warburg adopts acquire another kind of connotation, another spin again, when you see these terms employed in this scientific literature. So that's one thing. And the one crucial point about it is that most of these scientific investigations did not produce the intended results in the generation that conducted the research. There's a very important point. We have 2 generations virtually apart. Kandel finally literally delivers on the goods that Zeman was after. That between the 2/3 of a century between them. So I would say that the impasse, the terminological quandary, the scientific aporia that Warburg had to labor under could not be resolved by anybody at that time. So we got a very, very interesting disruptive discontinuity in the history of science. That a problem which is very acutely posed at one point may take 50 years, as Kandel sort of conversationally acknowledged at the end in the interview, to be reasonably answered. So this enormous proleptic projection it necessitated the constant hypothetical leaps that Warburg was making, like many others were making, right? Therefore, there is a very interesting problem internal to the entire history of culture, of which then science becomes a genuine branch, but not the trunk, right, of this construct of the cultural sciences. This entire project is coming together again at the end of the 20th century. And it is in fact unified by a new attempt to bring all the things back to bear upon what divided them at the beginning. So this is, I get some collaboration here from the wiring. I mean, this is a kind of a wonderful, energetic charge that this, you see? And the other thing I wanted to say, it's only one sentence, is that books and images are the Leiden flasks of of Warburg. They are the batteries. And that's why it matters which way you put the batteries together, whether you can induce a current from the batteries. And that you do by creating the Nachbarschaft. You kind of put the books together and drop them at night, right? And you know what I mean.
So, thank you. The next question.
It's clear that in this room there is a problem of energy. Energy is used for transmission, but also you hear there are some conflicts, and this is I think you raised an absolutely fundamental issue on Warburg. There is transmission, there is manet, and there is conflict, there is a maniac, polarization, antithesis, contradiction. I just want 1 minute. Darwin's chapter on antithesis, Freud's description of contradictory simultaneity in the hysterical crisis, the bisexuality, one part of the body, female, raped, the other part of the body, the male raping. Eisenstein's use of biomechanics and the question of the... Eisenstein, by the way, had a wonderful concept of his own, the concept of pathos formel. So he used the question of Otkaz, the negation of the gesture. Every gesture must be negated, etc. It was a question of aesthetics in Meyerhold, but it was also a question of experimental psychology in Kurt Lewin when Eisenstein met Kurt Lewin in Berlin. Okay, but I think to connect the trunk of your argument with the beginning, I would say that it's why Warburg began on this question, using a characterization of such an energy in the Vorbemerkung of the thesis on Botticelli, using the word Einfühlung. This is a problem. I think, briefly, we can say this. Schlosser said, to make art history is to be a philologist. He was a curator in a museum, and a philosopher. He was the translator in German of Benedetto Croce's work. But Warburg makes a complication. There is a third level. The third level is that you are a seismograph. And this is not easy, but you have a hypersensibility to energy. If the historical political energy scrambles the Europe, you scramble. So the Denchrom is distance, but the question of Einfühlung, we must think again.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Now we collect questions quickly.
Sorry. I think it was first here, Philip, and then.
Okay.
Sorry for.
It doesn't. No.
I think can you hear me?
Yes.
Is that right? This is a question for you, George. And it's not working. And I was wondering if I could ask you to be, or to push you into a dialectical swivel. I was very interested and convinced in your connection and in your insistence on a politics of affect connected to the question or the practice of gesture. You also quoted Agamben and Agamben's notion of the pure means, which I know you are aware of, derives from Benjamin and Benjamin's critique of violence. The interesting thing is that if you approach it from the Benjaminian side, you have a politics of gesture that relies on the suspension of the effective content, or at least the effective readability of gestures, which goes back to Brecht. So is there room in your theory for a politics of gesture that relies on the suspension of affect in gesture and the suspension of its expressive content?
So it's so many questions. I try to be brief. of course, my reading of such things is linked to Benjamin. Benjamin himself was linked to Brecht at a certain moment. But I don't think that the Verfremdung effect is a suspension of emotion. It's a suspension of identification. And when Brecht decided to show Helen Weigel crying, it's terrible. It's emotion, but it's silent because the source is a photograph. So there is, at the same moment, in the same mise en scène by Brecht, the pathos, extremely clear pathos with the open mouth and the distance. And this is wonderful. But it's not a suspension of emotion. It's a suspension of identification.
Okay, is this working? So I have a very simple question, maybe it's for Georges de Huberman, because I found very interesting. They use the attention to the detail of the cloth in the images, both of Eisenstein, Delacroix, Chris Marker, you know, the flags, the fabric, the white cloth that covers people. And so I was wondering, you know, because there is this relation between fabric and the body's gesture, and leave their imprints on the fabric. And the fabric as matter itself, it's kind of gesturing. If pathos formal is the persistence or survival of gestures across time, could we not say that there is also not only the pathos of form, but also a pathos of matter, of materials, that is not so much brought forward, you know, but that it may have a strong relation to how we respond to the images and how we respond to artworks as well?
To answer your question should be to study in each case what's the relation between the movement of the surface itself, the fabric, as you say, and the movement of the body. The two are interconnected, but there is no general law, I think, on pathos of the matter.
I would have a question to Kurt Forster. There are many veins that come out of this focus of energy and information you talked about. And in my view, the main vein would be quantum physics, coming from Zeilinger in these days. This very spooky thing, what quantum physics is, which nobody ever will be able to explain. He argued it's information, Gedankensprünge, information jumps that nature herself does. Coming from this, there is an incredibly interesting correspondence between Panofsky and Wolfgang Pauli, who was named the devil of quantum physics. Panofsky gave, when he got the Nobel Prize, the speech of honor at Princeton, and he came to Kepler and defended the enlightened Kepler. Afterwards, in this correspondence, they talk about Robert Flatt and the occult pictures of Robert Flatt. Panofsky is defending Kepler against Flatt, and the Nobel Prize winner, quantum physicist Pauli, defends Flatt and argues you need symbols that float. And both come from Hamburg. Both were friends already at Hamburg because they had both a terrible taste for very angry jokes on others. And it looks like as if Wolfgang Pauli is defending Aby Warburg in his concept of Kepler against the enlightened Panofsky, who only uses the enlightened pole. Yeah. And this is quantum physics all about. Yeah. It's rigid and spooky.
Yeah. It's just the same bifurcation that afterwards exists between the Warburg of Gombrich and the Warburg of us. Well, sort of. But of course you know the book by Pauli with C.G. Jung on Kepler, right? And that's why I actually sort of, in homage to Pauli, who spent more time in Zurich than in Hamburg, I refer to this spin. You know, but by this kind of the curious thing for which quantum physicists typically use a language like charm, flavor, color, and so forth, because it's in that domain. It is seemingly as if in matter you discovered something that is only comparable to the spontaneous innovations that manifest themselves in your own psychic state, rather than anything which could objectively be described. Although it can be objectively used, we would have no tomography if it weren't for the spin of the electrons that Wolfgang Pauli discovered. We couldn't make those pictures, right? So it is certainly there, can be tested, but the text is lacking.
Just one additional information, because Horst Bredekamp mentioned Kepler. Just last week I was able to confirm that that Warburg's last exhibition on the pictures of astronomy and astrology will be reinstalled in Hamburg Planetarium in 2017. This is the last remaining physical Warburgian object in Hamburg, and I invite everybody to come. It's around autumn 2017.
My question goes to Georges Didier Huberman, and I know that you will not be allowed to elaborate on something, and nonetheless I wanted to ask you whether you could at least briefly elaborate on the tension between individual and collective pathos-formel, if there is such a thing now, after that we heard your talk, because it seems to me that while Warburg his thoughts revolve around expressions of individual states, emotional states, the pathos formula of uprising is clearly a collective gesture, even the more because, for example, the fist of resistance is related, of course, to the hand of vote. So it both constitutes a collective, and at the same time it grants visibility to the individual within the collective.
I cannot elaborate in general, just have a look on in what way each artist or each photographer or, is able to construct a representation of what is a collective pathos. So in the case of Eisenstein, it's very specific how to choose the actors, how to make the frames, how to make the editing, etc., the rhythm, etc. So in each case, the relationship between collective and individual should be the result of the construction of a representation. So there is no general answer, I think.
So here, one question here. Thank you.
This comes from the observations about Manet. What strikes me is that there is a moment in the history of painting when the pathos of the gesture leaves the identifiable figure and enters the fabric of the paint itself. And it seems to me that Manet is precisely that moment. And this intrigues me because it raises the question of whether Warburg took notice of the form and the style in which these images were actually deposited and manifested. After all, an angel in stone is not the same thing as an angel in paint or an angel in a film. With each case, the spin changes. You don't have to be Marshall McLuhan to see that the medium alters the message. And so the question arises then, does the Bilder Atlas take any notice of this? Or does it contain the potential of it? After all, he's at the threshold of the movies, and the role of photography is already entering in. But once you get to somebody like, let's say, Muybridge, who is taking photographs of accidental and candid moments, which are not gestures, they're simply people caught in a frozen action. And it's those curiously awkward in-between sort of Zwischengäste, you might say, I suppose, that someone like Francis Bacon takes up. And then the term gesture in painting, by the time you reach Jackson Pollock, is nothing to do with the figure, it's to do with the embodied paint itself. So
I can only answer to the first part of your question. Warburg's problems have already been so complex that he did not take care about style and technique so much. He reduced, on his screens, he reduced everything into two-dimension, using many media to show this, mostly black and white photographs, but sometimes even reducing them, asking his wife Mary, a trained artist, to draw the outlines of a figure. And because what he wanted to have a diagram, an energetic diagram of a gesture. This was in his focus. If it was a watercolor or an oil paint or relief, it was not so important to him. On the other hand, he was I'm quite sure he was well aware of it. He was one of the first people using colored slides, which were very expensive at this time. So he was aware of the problem, but he did not integrate this problem, at least not in the compositions of his screens.
Can we collect the last two questions quickly, and then all the ideas we have to stop. David, let's stop.
Thank you, Professor Kurfoster, for your talk. And your talk is concentrated about the energy, and you follow a very interesting way in which you look at the wound, at the experimental and the physiological investigation of wood, and you arrive to cross the Simon memory thought, and in this way it's possible to arrive to the concept of Warburgian concept of inversion. I mean, the possibility to reflect and to arrive at the concept starting from the impression and reaction. The memory is very important because you can arrive to engramma as a thought, as a concept, as a possibility to reflection from a cognitive point of view. And in this way, you arrive to the role of the protein in the role as memory of protein and the candle thought. My question is, which is the relationship with this is a very important concept of energy with the experience of Warburg with the thought of Darwin? And it's very interesting, Darwin for Warburg, as emphasized Sigrid Weigel, about the problem. We know only this one, the problem, the impression and expression. It's like a mechanical, it's possible to say, relationship between impression and expression. The same interest about this mechanical response between impression and expression, Warburg experiment with the Pacconcelli calcia, is a physic, is very important, very friend of to Warburg, because Pacconcelli calcia experimented the relationship between sound and movement. And he sent to Warburg many publications about the movement at the dance, but is in a mechanical correspondence between the sound and the movement. And in this way, Warburg is interested about to give a scientific answer at the Moresca dance. Overall about Gasser, German sculpture. And my question is, there is two different ways, just 1 second, two different ways between the mechanical correspondence between impression and expression and the experiments about the energy.
Perhaps they hinge on the fact that something is represented by something else. This is a fundamental transfer that in our intelligence we're able to make. So typically, the creation of a pattern on a plate that is set into motion and makes a sound yields a readable geometric pattern of the loose particles that are exposed to the vibration that the sound create. These patterns are in no other way related physically to sound. They are merely a recording instrument. They're no more related to sound as your disc is related to furtwängler, right? I mean, in other words, the two things are of a completely separate standing of totally separate nature. And they're brought together again only in the moment which reflects the moment in which they were created, namely when the sound did sound or when the orchestra played and you heard it. And therefore, it's a very interesting question which vexed many people, how something is inscribed and how that script can at all conserve what is happening. Remember the little essay by Rainer Maria Rilke, if you met a needle of a gramophone onto the seam on your skull, what would that sound like? Would that sound like your skull? It's a very serious question. It's a wonderful question, and it takes the poetic leap of the imagination to say, well, here is a seam, here is a groove. A groove should yield a sound. And so forth. So the scientific issue that is very largely one that on the basis of representation, of making a sign for something, it can be handled in some fashion, but certainly not in any other direct confrontation.
Well, I'm slightly reluctant to raise to have the last word here today, I mean, at this session, because I'm going to talk to you along with Claudia right at the end. But it was such an interesting session with such diverse contributions that my hand shot up automatically when I heard various things that provoked disagreement. So I'm going to edit out all my comments, except to say one thing, perhaps. And that is, we've heard a lot about art and science today, and I think, we want to be a little careful about polarizing these hypostatized entities. Science and art are sort of very generic terms. I think they're much more polarized now than they were in Warburg's time, as we know when we think of the German use Wissenschaft. I don't think Warburg at any point was especially interested in the unity, several people used this phrase, of art and science. The term that he used, as I have emphasized in these days, is the notion of the Brückenbau, so that you make a bridge across two very different fields. I think if there is a task that lies ahead, which perhaps we'll talk more about this afternoon, which is to be open to other epistemologies. And the people who call themselves scientists have very clear epistemological principles which differ from those in the humanities. We must be open to this. We must be able to cross that bridge, but we can't become one or the other. This leads me on to one observation I wanted to make with regard to Kurt Forster's paper. This idea that the question of memory, as it were, the aporia of Richard Seemann is now concluded, as it were, is now resolved as a result of Eric Kandel, who is a colleague of mine at Columbia. You should never forget that he did not come from Hamburg, but he came from logical positivist Vienna. He really wants to emulate Ernst Gombrich, not Aby Warburg. And this is a big distinction that we need to think of. But if indeed Eric Kandel had resolved the question of cultural memory, then we would have nothing more to do. But he hasn't resolved the question of cultural memory. What Eric Kandel achieved was an understanding of the biological basis of the operations of the hippocampus, which is especially important in terms of the mechanisms of memory. But not even Eric would claim that he has resolved the question of what Richard Seemann called them Neme and the engram. Eric would not maintain that it resolved the question of the engram or cultural traces. This is the work that is left for us. We have to stay with the problem of cultural transmission. We have to stay with the mysteries of art, which are not infringed by the reductivism of science. We need to understand the scientists, but that is the task for the Warburg Institute going forward. What are the engines that continue cultural transmission? So that's how I want to end today.